Thank you, Senator Ruston. Senator Fawcett.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. I also rise to make some comments on the Social Services Legislation Amendment Number 2, Bill of 2015. I'll speak just briefly about the outline of the bill, and then I'd like to make a few comments based on my time in the other place where I was the local member for one of the areas that is impacted by this legislation. So the bill has two large sections. One is the Streamlined Income Management Bill, or Income Management section, that's Schedule 1 to the bill, and that amends the Social Security law to streamline the current income management program under a 2-year continuation. So the income management, the basics cards, will continue for an additional 2 years to support the existing income management participants. And the streamlining provisions of this bill will enable a more effective operation of the income management program. In particular, the bill provides for the abolition of certain incentive payments relating to income management and amends the operation of the vulnerable measure of income management and makes minor streamlining amendments to remove ambiguities and to improve the program's effectiveness. The second area is around Schedules 2 and 3, which are aged care measures, and they make amendments to reflect measures reflecting to aged care, which are included in the 14-15 mid-year economic and fiscal outlook announcement. The first of those measures is to cease payment from 1st of July 2015 of residential care subsidy to aged care providers for holding a place for up to 7 days prior to a recipient entering care. And the second is to abolish the Aged Care Planning Advisory Committee as part of the Smaller Government Initiative, and I'll come back to aged care in a minute. But I'd like to talk firstly about the City of Playford, which I had the privilege of representing when I was in the other place. For many years I had worked at the RAF base at Edinburgh, where I worked as a test pilot and eventually as the commanding officer of the Aircraft Research and Development Unit. And so I had flown over this area known as the Peachy Belt within the City of Playford for many years without actually interacting all that much with the community. But when I put my hand up to become the member for Wakefield, I took leave from the military. In fact, I resigned from the military, and I spent many months as an unpaid candidate door knocking and getting to know the community in that area. People like Sean Barbie from the Peachy Belt Residents Association, the Mayor, Marilyn Baker at the time, and later Martin Linsell, and a range of people embraced the fact that I was taking interest in this community. And whilst it has at various times had a pretty poor reputation, and the socioeconomic figures next to Redfern in terms of being an area of disadvantage, can I tell you that there was actually a strong sense of community within the Peachy Belt area, and I grew to appreciate and work closely with many people who lived in that area, who had a great aspiration to see the area develop and improve, both residents as well as people in organisations such as Anglicare and the many, Uniting Voice and others, who ran programs in the Peachy Belt area, food banks, carers associations, a range of people who wanted to make life better, and particularly teachers at schools such as Squalorcliff, who worked with young people, young Australians who came from some very disadvantaged backgrounds. And so it really opened my eyes to the needs as well as the strengths of a particular community within Australia. What really struck me, though, was the fact that there were parts of the community who were intergenerationally unemployed, and we're talking second, third, in some cases even fourth generation of people who were unemployed. And the thing that amazed me was that you had some young people, and one young lad I think of in particular, who lived in the eastern part of that area in Manapara, and in fact went to Gawler High School, who, despite having quite a dysfunctional home life and ended up couch surfing for much of his time, ended up achieving fantastic results in his Year 11 and Year 12, and went on with quite an artistic flair to study music at the Conserve in Adelaide. And it just really highlights the fact that you can't put people in boxes. You can't say that because you come from this area or this is your background that it limits what you can actually achieve. But what I also saw was people who had found that living on welfare was all that they aspired to. I came across young people who literally sought to be on a disability support pension. I had young men of 17, 18 come into my lecturate office, which was at the Manapara Shopping Centre, complaining because they hadn't been approved to go on a disability support pension at that age. And as I quizzed them and talked to them, it became quite apparent that many of them were quite capable of achieving far more than they actually believed they were capable of doing. And as you trace back and you look at the dysfunction that was often in the family, sometimes that was due to substance abuse, whether that be alcohol or drugs. Sometimes it was due to a dependency on things like pokies, which meant that there was very little money in the family or support for education. Sometimes it even stretched to the point where I remember speaking to the police sergeant at the Elizabeth Police Station once, who told me of a young man who had come into the police station and asked to be escorted home to collect his belongings. And the policeman initially told him to move on his way, but this young man persisted, and it turned out that he was literally at some risk of violence from his father because this young man had actually got a job. And that was such an undermining of the worldview that had been built by his father and his grandfather as to what they were owed, what they were capable or not capable of doing. And this young man had broken the mould to the point where he was actually at risk of violence. And I raise these points to highlight that whilst there is around, the figures vary from year to year, but 17% at any given time of people unemployed in that Playford area, youth unemployment significantly higher, and there's around 8%, depending on the period you look at, of long-term unemployed there. The fact is that there are young people who are being impacted by the inability or unwillingness of their parents to actually use the income that they have to provide for the education, the healthy living, just the basic clothing and diet or activities of young people. And this has a significant impact on their willingness, their self-confidence, their ability to take up opportunities that are provided to them. One of the things that in 2007, as both the member for Wakefield at the time, but also the chair of the government's Families, Community Services and Indigenous Affairs Committee under Minister Brough, as it was then, we actually looked at this. We looked at the number of services that were being provided there. And one of the challenges that kept on being thrown up to us by providers, even by teachers at schools, was the question of, we are putting all of these resources into these areas. Why, given the amount that is being put in, is the dysfunction continuing, and why are we not seeing sustainable turnarounds and changes in those communities? And one of the things that Minister Brough approved was an audit, which I believe, my recollection is correct, was conducted by Anglicare, where they looked to do an audit of the whole area to understand exactly what was being provided, on what basis was it being provided, and what outcomes was this support having. And I recall one of the options that was discussed at the time was income management. And you may recall, Madam Acting Deputy President, in 2007, as part of the federal government's Northern Territory emergency response, that income management was brought in, and part of the legislation actually allowed the option to extend this to areas other than the Northern Territory. So when we first started talking about that for some of these communities within Playford, I remember copping a fair shellacking in the media, and in fact my political opponent at the time was quite negative about it. But I was satisfied that we were on the right track when I was called by some teachers at one of the local primary schools who asked to meet with me. And I'd have to say they weren't naturally supporters of the Conservative side of politics, and so I went to meet them anticipating that perhaps I'd get a bit of a chest poking. But they were very clear that they saw themselves as being at the coalface of this issue of disadvantage and dysfunction. They were the ones dealing with young people in grades 1 and 2 who were coming to school having not had breakfast, possibly not even having dinner the night before, kids who were worse than latchkey children who were really fending for themselves, who found it hard to concentrate at school for the lack of nutrition, who found that they were always behind the 8 ball because mum, and generally it was only mum and possibly a stepdad or a partner, were down at the pub or down playing pokies, and so they didn't have that support to help them read. And if you look at the early years of learning, those really crucial years to imbue in children an understanding of language and concepts and shapes and colours, names, that the things that are the basic building blocks if you want to get ahead in life. And often these were not being provided because the parents were spending their time, because they were spending their money in other pursuits. And these teachers were saying, we support these measures. We live, we work at the coalface with these people. We support a change that will make a difference for these children. And so that sticks in my mind as I think about income management and the discussions that are occurring now in other areas of South Australia, such as Ceduna, areas of Indigenous disadvantage around the country, because the fact is there are some people in our community who, through choice, through circumstance, through a lack of training or capacity on their own part, perhaps poor parenting that they've received, lack the will or the competence to manage their income. There are other programs that we need to wrap around to help people. Income management alone, whilst it's a tool that is effective, there are other programs we need to wrap around people, and I particularly look in South Australia at groups like Service to Youth Council, who have had a long-term investment in areas such as the Playford City Council in Elizabeth and in the Peachy Belt, working with young people to help them overcome many of these areas of disadvantage. Unlike many government programs, which tend to be very stovepiped, holistic approaches are really the only way to help people to take a hand up as opposed to live on a continual hand out. So whilst income management tries to help people both have the money to spend on their children, tries to avoid them spending it on things like alcohol or gambling, we also need to be wrapping the services around these young people to make up the gaps for some of the life skills and things they haven't picked up from their parents. Service to Youth in particular does a great job of a holistic model of caring for these young people in South Australia, and the results are very clearly showed in the outcomes they achieve in terms of the number who enter their programs, who then go on to secure work and are still in work 12 months later. And their model is very much wrapped around providing care for the person in terms of housing. They've even used their own discretionary funds to create a number of what they call hyper housing, helping young people to achieve, because they've recognised that if you're couch surfing or you've got nowhere permanent to live, or even if you're a young person from a country area seeking to do an apprenticeship in the city and you have nowhere affordable to live and you're trying to drive home each night or you're living in your car, that's not a way to sustain education and meaningful work outcomes. They recognise that there are life skills that many of these young people whose parents to date have not had income management and have not had the encouragement to invest in their children, they're not work ready. Sometimes some of their programs start off with just getting them consistently getting out of bed on time and actually turning up to a workplace and starting to shape their understanding and their expectation of what it is that an employer might want them to do. And the fact that an employer has the right, in fact the obligation, to instruct them, to tell them how to work, to keep them safe, and that there's a realistic expectation that they will put in a good day's work to get a good day's return. Coupled with education and coupled with essentially pastoral care or social work support, we find that many of these young people have good outcomes. Now that's great, and I thoroughly commend Service to Youth Council for the work they do, but surely we should be trying to put systems in place where the family unit, the biological parents of the child, are the ones who have the interest and the resource to invest in these kids, to give them the life skills that they need to get that start in education, to make that transition from education to work. And if the things that cause the dysfunction, the lack of interest, the lack of capacity are so often tied to misuse of money which has come from the taxpayer, spent on things like alcohol or gambling, then I am 100% behind the measures around income management, coupled with, as I say, things to help people in terms of budgeting and to work towards an independent point where they can manage those funds in their own right. The other area I'd just quickly touch on is the aged care reforms, and I mentioned briefly what the outcomes are here. The other comment I'd just make on aged care, having held a round of consultations last week with the Assistant Health Minister and talking with people in rural areas in South Australia, is that the My Aged Care website, which is up, I recognise that as we try and streamline information and make it accessible to people, it does need to be navigable by the average man in the street. Having looked at it and tried to go through it myself, it's one area that I believe we need to be constantly seeking feedback from users to make sure that things like the My Aged Care website is workable, so that people who are seeking residential care and the various payments that go along with it have all the information they need in a useful manner. And I guess one of my strong contentions is that whilst there are savings to be had by centralising programs and having it all done out of one office, that there are also local differences that we see, whether we're talking in the health care area, whether we're talking in the aged care area, and it's important that particularly where we have a function that constitutionally has been the responsibility of the federal government, that we recognise that there are local inputs that will be required, even in something as basically as a national website, that what might appear logical to somebody sitting on the east coast, when somebody in Gawler in South Australia looks for a service provider, when something is the other side of the city, it's clearly not the service that they're going to need, and that geographic split may not be known by somebody sitting on the east coast. So there are things that we can still be doing to make those systems more effective. But I welcome the measures in the bill and the government amendments to the bill, but particularly I welcome the 2-year continuation of the income management program, because I have seen firsthand the impacts on young people in Australia where their caregivers, often a mum, often a stepdad or a partner, use the benefits that are provided to them by the taxpayer on things like alcohol and gambling to the great detriment of young people, and anything we can do to improve the circumstances, the basic education and care for the young people, every member of this Senate should be supporting.
Thank you, Senator Fawcett.